I really think that we've just been able to encapsulate the amount of difference in not only in my voice but in the kind of person I've become over these past 2.5 years.
What if the only way to beat a monster was to raise one of your own? Picture this, a state overrun by 17-foot predators, a swamp so vast and tangled that hunters could walk within 10 feet of a giant snake and never know it, and a group of scientists who came up with a plan so strange that late-night hosts joked about it and neighbors rolled their eyes. Florida's answer to an invasion nobody could stop was to release trackable creatures of their own into the wilderness, betting that the enemy's own instincts would lead them straight into a trap. People called it desperate. People called it a joke. Then the numbers started coming in, and nobody was laughing anymore. This is the real story of how Florida turned the tables on an invasion that was quietly devouring the Everglades, and how a handful of biologists, a lot of stubbornness, and thousands of pounds of snake later, actually started winning. To understand why Florida had to get creative, you have to go back to August of 1992, when Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida as a Category 5 storm. Homes were flattened, entire neighborhoods disappeared, and in the chaos, a python breeding facility near Miami was destroyed. Cages broke open, fences came down, and an unknown number of Burmese pythons, animals native to the swamps and grasslands of Southeast Asia, slipped out into the wetlands surrounding the Everglades. Some escaped directly from that facility. Others were pets that had simply grown too large for their owners to handle and were dumped in the wild over the following years. Either way, the result was the same. A cold-blooded, heat-seeking, ambush predator with no natural enemies had just found a brand new home that looked almost exactly like the one it left behind. For a while, nobody thought much of it. A snake here, a snake there. Surely the swamp would sort itself out. But Burmese pythons do not play by the rules of a balanced ecosystem. They can grow past 17 feet long and weigh well over 100 pounds. They can swim for miles, climb trees, burrow into the mud, and swallow prey far larger than their own head. And in the Everglades, they found something they'd never had in their homeland, nothing that could kill them back. No tigers, no leopards, no natural predator waiting in the reeds. Just an endless buffet of raccoons, rabbits, birds, deer, and eventually alligators, all of it theirs for the taking. What made it worse was the timing. South Florida in the early 1990s was still a booming hub for the exotic pet trade, and Burmese pythons were already a popular, if increasingly oversized, choice for reptile enthusiasts. Long before the hurricane, casual owners had been quietly releasing pythons that outgrew their tanks and their patience, adding a slow trickle of animals into the wetlands even before the storm blew the door wide open. By the time wildlife officials connected the dots and realized a breeding population had taken hold inside Everglades National Park, the snakes already had a decade-long head start. There was no single moment where anyone could point and say, "That's when it started." There was only the slow, creeping realization that something enormous had been quietly multiplying in the background the entire time. By the time researchers realized how bad things had gotten, the damage was already staggering. Long-term surveys comparing wildlife populations before and after the python boom found that raccoon sightings had collapsed by more than 99%, opossum numbers had dropped by nearly the same amount, and bobcats had fallen by roughly 8 to 7%. Marsh rabbits and cottontails, once common enough to barely notice, had all but vanished from large stretches of the park. In one especially grim study, scientists released dozens of radio-collared marsh rabbits into python territory just to measure what would happen to them. And within less than a year, pythons were responsible for the overwhelming majority of the deaths. Biologists began pulling deer, bobcats, wading birds, and even full-grown alligators out of python stomachs. This wasn't a pest problem anymore. It was a total rewiring of the food chain, and the apex predator doing the rewiring was an animal that wasn't even supposed to be there. The trouble was, nobody could actually find the snakes to stop them. Burmese pythons are masters of camouflage, their mottled brown and tan pattern blending seamlessly into the sawgrass and cypress shadows. They spend most of their time motionless, coiled and waiting, sometimes fully submerged with just their nostrils above the waterline. Traditional hunting methods barely made a dent. Even experienced trackers walking shoulder to shoulder through the brush would step past a 15-foot python without ever seeing it. Florida wasn't just fighting an invasive species anymore. It was fighting an animal that had essentially become invisible in its own stolen kingdom. So here's where the story gets strange and where the laughter started. A team of biologists, led by a wildlife scientist named Ian Bartasek working with the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, floated an idea that sounded almost backwards. If you can't find the snakes, why not let a snake find them for you? The plan involved capturing adult male pythons, surgically implanting small radio transmitters inside their bodies, and then releasing them right back into the swamp they came from. These tagged males, nicknamed scout snakes, would do exactly what male pythons do during breeding season, which is roam for miles searching for a receptive female. The biologists would simply follow the radio signal, let the male do all the hard work of finding a mate, and then swoop in to capture the breeding female before she could lay a single egg. When word of the idea spread, plenty of people thought it sounded like a joke dressed up as science. Release more snakes into a swamp that already had too many snakes? Trust a python's love life to solve a public safety crisis? Local news segments treated it as a curiosity. Online commenters mocked it as the kind of plan only a cartoon villain would come up with, and more than a few skeptics assumed it would quietly disappear within a year, filed away with all the other well-meaning but doomed government pilot programs. Even some conservationists worried it was a gimmick, a flashy headline that wouldn't move the needle on a problem measured in the tens of thousands of snakes. But the science behind it was more sophisticated than the jokes gave it credit for. Male Burmese pythons, it turns out, are relentless when hormones kick in. During breeding season, which runs roughly from November through April, a tagged male will travel for miles across open water, dense brush, and private ranchland, following pheromone trails left by females. Biologists load up a truck with a directional antenna and a handheld receiver, drive out into the backcountry, and listen for a faint, steady beep that grows louder the closer they get. Once they close in, they don't just find one snake. Sometimes they find what researchers call a mating aggregation, a tangled cluster of several male pythons all converging on a single reproductively active female. In one documented case, biologists tracking a scout snake stumbled onto a group of 8 pythons in one spot, 7 males wrapped around a single enormous female. That female is the real prize. A single adult female Burmese python can lay between 50 and 100 eggs in a clutch, meaning that removing one pregnant female before she nests can prevent an entire generation of pythons from ever hatching. This is the quiet genius of the scout snake strategy. It doesn't just remove snakes at random. It targets the exact individuals doing the most damage to future python populations, using the snake's own biology as the bait. The male scout snakes are released again and again after each capture, sometimes surviving for years in the program, becoming oddly famous within the small community that follows this work. Researchers give them names. One well-known scout snake named Dion led biologists straight to a record-breaking female. Another named Dion helped track down what would become, at the time, the largest python ever weighed in the state. So did it actually work? This is where the story stops sounding like a punchline and starts sounding like a genuine turning point. Since the Scout Snake program began in 2013, the Conservancy's team has used a rotating group of tagged males, at times tracking around 40 snakes simultaneously, to comb roughly 200 square miles of public and private land stretching from Naples into the western Everglades. Since it started, the program has prevented an additional 20,000 python eggs from ever hatching. Over the program's history, biologists have used the technique to remove more than 1,000 pythons weighing in at over 30,000 pounds combined, and that number has only kept climbing. The most recent seasons have broken records that even the program's own scientists didn't expect. Field teams have now removed over 20 tons of Burmese pythons since the program's launch, with the male scout snakes continuing to lead researchers to breeding-age females across the 200-square-mile study area. Then came the season that shattered every previous milestone. Between November 2025 and April 2026, biologists and volunteers with the Conservancy's Python Action Team pulled 177 Burmese pythons out of the Collier County study area, totaling 8,080 pounds of snake, and destroying more than 4,100 eggs in the process, making it the largest single-season haul the program had ever recorded. A scout snake nicknamed Snarquin made the very first capture of that record season, leading researchers to a 17-foot, 148-pound female before winter had even properly set in. Perhaps the most fascinating detail buried in all of this data is what it suggests about the invasion itself. Bartasek and his team have noted that as the years go on, their scout snakes are having a harder time finding mates in certain zones, and the females they do find tend to be smaller than the giants captured in the program's earlier years. To a biologist, that's not a discouraging sign. That's exactly what success is supposed to look like: fewer large, established breeders left in the population, and more evidence that years of targeted removal are finally starting to bend the curve. Nobody is claiming the python problem is solved. The Everglades are enormous, and pythons remain masters of hiding. But for the first time since the 1990s, there's real, measurable evidence that a sustained, science-driven strategy can put a dent in an invasion that once seemed unstoppable. And then there are the outliers, the individual snakes so massive they end up making national news on their own. In one of the most talked-about captures in the program's history, a scout snake led biologists deep into the Picayune Strand State Forest to a female python that weighed in at 215 pounds and measured nearly 18 feet long, carrying 122 developing eggs in her body. When the team finally hoisted her onto a scale, one of the biologists later admitted there was audible disbelief in the room, a mix of nervous laughter and stunned silence at a number nobody had expected to see. That single capture alone accounted for more than 100 pythons that would never hatch, never grow, and never spend the next decade quietly emptying out another patch of Everglades wildlife. It's the kind of moment that turns a spreadsheet full of statistics into something visceral, a reminder that behind every eggs prevented number is an animal the size of a small car being physically dragged out of the brush. The Scout Snake program wasn't the only piece of this puzzle, and it wasn't the only idea that got laughed at before it got respected. In 2013, Florida wildlife officials launched something called the Florida Python Challenge, an open competition inviting ordinary members of the public, not just trained biologists, to head into the swamp and remove as many pythons as they legally and safely could, with cash prizes for the most snakes caught and the longest snake landed. Critics called it a publicity stunt, a way for the state to look like it was doing something without actually solving anything. A 10-day contest against an infestation numbering in the tens of thousands of snakes? It sounded almost insulting in its scale. And yet the challenge kept growing, year after year, and it kept getting better. In the 2025 edition of the competition, 934 participants representing 30 states and Canada took part over 10 days, collectively removing a record 294 invasive Burmese pythons from South Florida. That year's event even expanded to include Everglades National Park itself as one of 8 official competition locations for the first time. The grand prize winner, a Naples-based wildlife handler named Taylor Stanberry, personally removed 60 pythons during the competition and walked away with a $10,000 top prize, while other competitors split additional money across novice, professional, and military divisions based on total snakes caught and longest snake measured. Zoom out even further and the picture becomes even more remarkable. Across every Florida Python Challenge event held to date, competitors have removed over 1,400 pythons combined, while contractors working for the state's wildlife agency and its water management district have removed more than 16,000 pythons since 2017 alone. All told, more than 23,000 wild Burmese pythons have been formally removed from the state and reported to wildlife officials since the year 2000. Every single one of those numbers started as a program that critics dismissed as gimmicky, symbolic, or too small to matter. Every single one of them ended up contributing real, cumulative pressure against an invasion that had once seemed completely beyond human control. Behind every one of those numbers is a person willing to do something most people would never volunteer for: walk into snake-infested wetlands, often at night, deliberately hunting for an animal capable of crushing a grown man. Professional python hunters have become an unlikely fixture of South Florida culture over the past decade, a small community of contractors, wildlife handlers, and hobbyists who know the backroads of the Everglades better than most park rangers. Some are veteran wranglers with decades of reptile handling experience. Others started as curious weekend competitors in the Python Challenge and never stopped. The work is slow, uncomfortable, and often fruitless for hours at a stretch, spent scanning canal banks with a spotlight for the telltale gleam of python eyes reflecting back through the dark, or easing a truck along a levee road at 3 miles an hour while checking every shadow along the tree line. It's also become surprisingly competitive. Contracted hunters working for state agencies are paid based on the length of the pythons they remove, which has turned tracking down the biggest, oldest, most reproductively significant snakes into both an ecological priority and a point of professional pride. During Python Challenge Week, that competitive spirit multiplies. Hundreds of participants, from total beginners with a flashlight and a burlap sack to seasoned professionals with years of night hunting experience, fan out across 8 official hunting zones for 10 straight days, comparing notes, trading tips, and occasionally running into each other in the dark chasing the same set of eyes in the grass. It's dirty, occasionally dangerous, frequently anticlimactic work. And yet it keeps drawing people back, year after year, because every single python pulled out of the water is one less predator emptying out the ecosystem underneath it. Beyond the scout snakes and the citizen hunters, researchers have also been quietly chasing longer-term solutions that sound almost like science fiction. Federal scientists with the U.S. Geological Survey have been researching genetic biocontrol methods, techniques that would target pythons at the level of their own DNA to limit their ability to reproduce successfully, without harming native species that share the same habitat. This kind of research moves slowly and carefully by design. Manipulating genetic material in a wild population requires years of testing, strict safety reviews, and layers of federal permitting before anything could ever be released outside a laboratory. Precisely because the goal is surgical precision, not another uncontrolled introduction into an ecosystem that's already been burned once by an invasive species let loose. Alongside that, researchers have also experimented with pheromone-based detection tools, essentially trying to bottle the same chemical signals that make the scout snake program work, in the hope of building traps or detection systems that don't require surgically tagging live animals at all. Detector dogs, trained specifically to sniff out python scent trails through dense brush, have also become part of the broader toolkit, working alongside the scout snakes and human hunters rather than replacing them. None of these methods work alone. It's the combination, hormone-driven scout snakes leading biologists to breeding hotspots, annual public hunting competitions pulling thousands of extra eyes into the field, professional contractors working year-round removal contracts, and a slow-moving pipeline of genetic and chemical research aimed at the future that has finally started to add up to something that looks less like a losing battle and more like actual progress. Here's the part of the story that even people who've followed the Python saga for years often don't know about, and it's a genuinely strange twist. While Florida has spent over a decade trying to release trackable creatures to hunt down pythons, the pythons themselves brought along an unwanted hitchhiker of their own, a parasite called Raeliatiella orientalis, a small worm-like organism native to Southeast Asia that arrived in Florida the same way the snakes did. This parasite first showed up in Florida around the